The requirements in general should be between 0.3 and 0.5 units per kilogram per day. So if you have
insulin sensitive.
Yes, exactly. So the type 1s supposedly are insulin sensitive. So yeah, that's what I aim for. I aim for about 0.3 because you want the lowest amount of insulin also for type 1s, right? So
sure.
So and you can achieve that. You know, there are patients that have been long-term diabetics who end up 8-9 units a day of basal, no problem. Some that we even get down further. But
and that's a level where you're not going to be having too much insulin resistance. I mean, you're going to be basically having perfect health, normal lifespan with that.
I believe so. I think we've really seen that type 1s are subject to the same problems as type 2s, right? If they eat whatever they want, coming back to the beginning of the conversation, then they're going to gain weight, but it's going to be even worse because they have high basal levels all day long. So all, you know, in a very, not just when they eat and then have a dip down to it, like even insulin resistant people have decreases in insulin between meals to some extent, but type 1s don't. If they're on high basal levels, then they're high for very long, very long periods of time. We have about 10 patients who presented with type 1 diabetes, were on insulin, but fairly recently diagnosed, and then you put them on a ketogenic diet and then are able to be off insulin already for years. And I think that's really exciting, and I think people should know that it's worth trying.
There are case studies, I mean, looking at the autoimmune protocol and stuff, with basically lectin elimination diets, where you basically get incredibly prolonged honeymoon phases in type 1 diabetics. I check all of my type 2, and when I say type 2, every patient gets an antibody screen. Okay. And frequently, these guys who are clear-cut type 2 diabetics are not clear-cut type 2 diabetics. They have, as you know, LADA, the latent autoimmune diabetes of childhood.
Right.
And I certainly believe that people with that autoimmune component, I don't think a ketogenic diet is optimal for them. I think you really need to go on a low lectin diet as well. And it just makes sense. I mean, if you've got, type 2, type phenotype of insulin resistance, and then you've got the type 1 stuff where your pancreas is being smashed by your immune system,
And what do you see when you eliminate the lectins in this latter population?
So just generally a much tighter glucose control. So some people on a ketogenic diet, they still struggle with their sugar controls. And there's something about going on a low lectin diet that then improves that significantly, even over and above what a low carb diet will. And we also know that wheat germ agglutinin and concavalin and other lectins have actually been demonstrated to bind to insulin receptors and to stimulate de novo lipogenesis and have these other effects as well. So anywhere where you think that you might have a lectin problem, and I think there's no better suggestion of that than having antibodies, an autoimmune issue, cut out the lectins and see what happens. It's absolutely quite fascinating that, they've got studies where in animals admittedly, but when they give them lectins, they gain weight. Their sugar control worsens. They take the lectins away, things get better. I don't have a strong opinion on it. I know that a lot of people do, say that nose to tail and so on and so forth. I don't think you need to go chasing if you don't like it. I think there's plenty of people out there who are in great health who don't eat offal, who don't eat the odds and ends of the animal. And certainly if we have a look at the nutrient analysis of things, and you mentioned eggs, I mean, eggs is nature's multivitamin. As we said before, it's got a whole functioning organism that comes out of it. There can be nothing left wanting from a nutrient perspective from an egg yolk. So I think if you're having enough foods like that, the nutrient density of animal foods by and large is so much more than plant foods anyway. I don't think that you have to have liver, to top it up. And for me personally, I don't eat a lot of liver.
I think I'm a little bit afraid of stopping all vegetables if you don't have internal organs. I think you need to complement that.
But this is a common theme and what it really shows is that the level of indoctrination that we've had from these dietary guidelines that tell us that vegetables are an essentially healthy food. And if you actually sit down and you go and do a Google search and you say, okay, what nutrients are in vegetables? What nutrients are in vegetables that I can't get from meat? You're going to have a very short list because it's not going to have anything on it. So if you have a look for essential nutrients in veggies that you can't get from animal foods, there's none. There is literally none. So, I mean, but this is the problem. I mean, it's almost like a religious indoctrination. Once it's in your head, it's almost impossible to get out. We've been force-fed this notion that fruits and vegetables are incredibly healthy foods.
Right.
And
but what about the soup broth? What is your feeling?
Bone broth. I don't do that. So here's the thing about bone broth. If you've ever made a bone broth, you'll see all this sediment at the bottom.
Yeah. Yeah.
And most people I know won't drink that sediment.
And that's where it's at.
Where do you think all the minerals and everything is there? When they've actually, they do an analysis on a typical bone broth looking at the potassium and stuff like that, it's actually not that high. There's nothing particularly special about bone broth unless you're spooning in, that sediment at the bottom, which, just imagine just having a bit of crunchy gravel. Doesn't appeal to me. And I'm a bit of a hedonist. I eat what I feel like. I eat what I want. I eat what gives me pleasure. Mm-hmm. And I'll be honest, the thought of that doesn't fill me with joy. So you mentioned before that the ketogenic diet is a dehydrating diet.
Yeah.
So it's because in the kidneys, there's 4 transporters that tell the body to hold on to sodium, and they are all stimulated by insulin. You go on a ketogenic diet, that is a sodium wasting state. Your body loses sodium. You lose sodium, you lose volume, because sodium is what holds the water in it, what attracts the fluid. So that's how a ketogenic diet is a dehydrating diet. So if you're having a chicken broth, chicken soups or what have you, there's a lot of sodium in that. That is basically correcting a sodium deficiency that reliably occurs when people start a ketogenic diet until their kidneys figure it out.
Yeah, no, of course. And but it's just amazing to see the result. I mean, it's just a before and after. There's something magical to this. It's not just adding salt to the meat or etc. There's I guess the combination of the fluid plus the salts, but
there might be potassium in there as well. It might be a mix of electrolytes. If we have a look at some of the studies, so Steve Finney, when they did their studies on back in the 80s on people getting them on treadmill tests and stuff like that, they figured out unless they aggressively and specifically supplemented with sodium, their performance suffered dramatically. They were basically incapable of intense physical exercise if they didn't get enough sodium. Yeah. And we have some other studies that show things like potassium and phosphate, nitrogen, which is basically protein, studies that you can't do nowadays. So they had people on intravenous feedings, and they were monitoring their body compartments, their bone, their fat, and their muscle. And they said, what happens if we just completely eliminate sodium from their feeding? Let's see what happens. So stuff that you couldn't do nowadays. So what happened? So their ability to form muscle tissue dropped by 2/3. What happens when they took potassium out? Their ability to form muscle tissue dropped by about 100%.
Whoa. Okay.
So these electrolytes and these other substances, they have we often pay lip service because we've heard it repeated, electrolytes are important. But when you actually ask people, why do you think electrolytes are important? They can't give you a good answer. They just know, very similar to what you've just said, when you have it, you just feel so much better. And I mean, it's because it's maintenance of intravascular volume. And if you're trying to build more tissue, we have these things called intracellular electrolytes, extracellular. We know that inside cells you have a lot of potassium. So if you're going to be trying to form new cells, you better be providing the building blocks. This is the same theory as building bone. You can't build bone with calcium alone. You need protein. You can't build new cells of any sorts without all the required ingredients for inside that cell. That includes electrolytes. Right. And that's why giving sodium is good for building bone. So in the Women's Health Initiative study, they actually looked at sodium intake, and they found that a low sodium intake was significantly correlated with a higher risk of hip fracture. So how do I prescribe the diet? So that's different to what I do, because I'm very much I eat a lot of food that's probably got enough potassium in it. I put salt on, and I put a lot of salt on. If I was eating out, people look at me strange. And if I have too much salt, I figure my kidneys will sort it out. For my patients who are, if they're insulin resistant, we know that a lot of people are underdoing magnesium. So there's one study that looked at magnesium in athletes, and that we can't reliably assess body levels of magnesium on a blood test. That's the problem. And if we do it with the gold standard labeled urine studies and see what comes out in the urine, that's just incredibly time consuming and expensive. It's just not practical. But when they have done this type of expensive test in athletes, they found that at least 40% of athletes are actually deficient in magnesium. And magnesium supplementation has been shown to be beneficial with regards to insulin sensitivity and a bunch of other things. It's essential for over 300 reactions within the body. So magnesium is pretty high up there for what is often deficient, and very low risk for actually supplementing with it. And it also has the other advantage that when you supplement with magnesium, you enhance the body's capacity to hold on to potassium. And that's good because giving potassium directly is fraught. So if you don't have enough potassium, you can have an arrhythmia, which is an electrical instability of your heart. If you have too much potassium, you can have an arrhythmia. Same problem. So this is why in Australia, you can't buy potassium over the counter.
You have to respect potassium.
Yeah, but the beauty is if you have more magnesium, you enhance your body's capacity to address the sodium, the potassium levels. So I remember when we used to work in the hospitals and we used to have people going into congestive cardiac failure, and we used to always try and get their MAG over 1 and their K over 4. I mean, there's very good evidence, K being potassium, and that's just our units. Because we know that if I didn't drive up the magnesium level first, or at the same time, I knew I would always be chasing my tail, getting their potassium level into the nice zone. So, but once their magnesium level was up, it was much easier for them to maintain their potassium level. So magnesium is something that I actually think from a lot of people, especially if you're not in optimal metabolic health, I think it doesn't hurt to take. And then there's a hell of a lot of questions. And you talk about which particular formulation. Do you want a magnesium aspartate? Do you want a citrate? Do you want, an oxide, or, what have you? And probably the only thing I'd say is stay away from the oxide. I mean, that causes diarrhea and loose stools, and it's incredibly poorly absorbed, and it's cheap, and that's the most common one. You can get one that's chelated with an amino acid, but the problem is the magnesium is very small. The amino acid is often very big. So the amount of what we call elemental magnesium that you get in these chelated formulations is actually very little. You can get something called magnesium citrate, which has much higher doses of magnesium. It's a little bit less diarrhea provoking than the magnesium oxide, but it still can cause it. But at the end of the day, that's probably the one I'll start people on now, just because it's cheaper and it's easier to get larger doses. And if you don't tolerate that, then it's reasonable to go to one of these other chelated ones. And I know a lot of people talk about, oh, I need to have 3 and 8, or I need to have aspartate or something like this because of the other benefit, or the orotate because of the extra benefit that you get from the amino acid that it's chelated with. But I've looked at a lot of that research and I've been pretty underwhelmed. In a nutshell, the problem with constipation is you're trying to pass something through a small hole, and fiber makes that something bigger. So how on earth did we think that making something bigger would make it easier to pass through our anal sphincter? And so if you think about it logically, like I'd say, oh, yes, but it might be the fluid retention. Nope, not, because way back in the 1970s, they actually measured the moisture content of stool of people with lots of fiber and stool and people with no fiber in their diet. No difference. So it's not the fluid. So is it the consistency? Nope, not that either. So what is it? It's somebody came up with an idea once, probably to try and sell some cereal. And they basically, pulled the wool over the eyes of most of the doctors who are still practicing today. When I was writing a chapter for a medical textbook, and I was writing the section on fiber, and I was trying to go find the original references. And I said, okay, well, this will be easy. Fiber good for constipation. I just need to find the reference. I could find guidelines. I couldn't find an original study. So I looked at the studies they were citing, and they said, okay, fiber increases the size of the stool. And it's like, sure, we know that. But patients don't come to me. I've never had a patient come and go, doc, my fecal matter is too small. Do you think you could bulk it out a bit? That's not what people complain about. Other studies on increasing the transit time can help it, passage through the gastrointestinal tract a little bit quicker. Again, I've never had anybody say, you know what, doc, I've got a 72-hour transit time at the moment. Do you think you could just speed it up a bit? Patients don't care. They care about pain. They care about bloating. They care about bleeding. They care about these things that cause them physical discomfort. So I wanted to, this is how we diagnose constipation, based on symptoms. So I went looking for the research, the science, based on the symptoms. And I couldn't find any randomized control trials. There was none. So what I could find, the best experimental study I could find, it was still an experimental design, and it had people who were on their normal, they had, I think it was 63 patients with idiopathic constipation, which basically means constipation of no known cause, which is what basically most people with constipation will be diagnosed with. They'll say, we don't know why you're constipated, but it's fine, it's normal. So these guys are already on a relatively high fiber diet on average. So some of them were put on a very high fiber diet. Some of them were put on a medium fiber diet. Some of them were put on a low fiber diet. And then they pulled a rabbit out of the hat. And then they put a bunch of them on a 0 fiber diet. So 41 of them actually ended up on a 0 fiber diet. So they had like these 5 symptoms of constipation. And every single participant on the 0 fiber diet had complete resolution in all 5 domains. Okay? But most commonly is cheese, dairy. So the beta-casein can be metabolized into an opiate-like compound in some people. Okay. And we know what the effects of opiates are on the gastrointestinal tract. It reduces gastric motility. So there's something about dairy in a subset of the population that seems to be constipation provoking. So if somebody's on a carnivore diet and they're having symptoms of constipation, cutting out dairy is the first thing to try. you can produce short-chain fatty acids from bacterial fermentation of fiber, and those short-chain fatty acids can be taken up to cells lining the colon, and those cells will then convert the short-chain fatty acid into a ketone that can be used for energy, and then that colonocyte with more energy can produce mucus and create a protective layer. Why not be in systemic ketosis? And the reason for this is that fiber is only fermented in a very small part of the colon. And where it's fermented and these short-chain fatty acids are produced, these short-chain fatty acids are only exposed to a very limited population of colonocytes lining the bowel. So if you've got pathology anywhere else in the bowel, then it's not going to do a lick of good. But if you're in systemic ketosis and had ketones going around your whole circulation, going around to the whole colon, the whole intestine, you'd be in a much, much better position. And then let's not overlook the fact that, you know, feeding bacteria the wrong things can be very dangerous. And we have no better evidence of this than something called Clostridium difficile, which can cause a condition called pseudomembranous colitis. Now, back in the about 2000, some Japanese scientists figured out how to manufacture on an industrial scale a sugar called trehalose. Now, this was able to lower the freezing point of dairy, which made it really a very nice additive for things like ice cream. So it didn't take long for this to take off around the world. I think about 2002 or something, it got introduced to the food supply in Australia. And whenever this sugar trehalose got introduced, it correlated very nicely with the onset of an epidemic of pseudomembranous colitis. And that's because this bug, this pathogenic bacteria called Clostridium difficile, preferentially feeds off this trehalose where other bacteria, basically feeding it trehalose allows it to outcompete other bacteria within the gut. It does a better job of eating that or fermenting that than other bacteria do. And that's been shown, and this is not weak research, and this is not just me theorizing, this was published in Nature. There was a couple of articles in Nature about this. So we have to be careful that we don't want to feed the bad bugs, and that's for sure. But also understand that this whole concept of taking probiotics is just bollocks. Because if I introduce bacteria into my gastrointestinal tract, I've just told you that, you know, if I change the amount of food you eat, you can outcompete, or you can cause some bacteria to thrive and basically suppress other bacteria. And that's what happens to probiotics. If you have a healthy probiotic, but you don't feed it the right food, they're not going to sustain there. We know that there's studies that show that you can get basically a wholesale change in your microbiome in 24 hours. So basically bacteria die off pretty quickly, they outcompete very quickly. And in India, there's a condition called necrolizing enterocolitis, where we have basically an infection inside the intestines. It happens in very young babies, and it's very dangerous. And they came up with a term called synbiotic, because they thought, well, let's try and put in a probiotic to outcompete the bad bacteria. What happened? Those bacteria were just washed away. They were outcompeted. So then they gave it with another food source that these bacteria could use. So they fed the probiotic and the food source at the same time. So hence the term syn, as in synergistic, for a synergistic effect, synbiotic. And that had a positive effect. So as far as I'm aware, the only real role for probiotics from a health perspective with regards to traveller's diarrhea is where you need to be taking them in quite large doses and taking them continuously. So basically that they sort of suppress any pathogenic bacteria which you might or compete with and outcompete any other pathogenic bacteria that you might ingest inadvertently. But if you don't take it repeatedly or in high doses, then that's useless as well. And it's only ever going to be the short-term effect. And we now have very good evidence that taking probiotics causes gastrointestinal upset in a lot of people as well. So they're not without side effect. So artificial sweeteners. So if we have a look at the polyol class, the sugar alcohol. So the first thing that a lot of people recognize is polyol. I've heard that somewhere before, and that's a P in FODMAPs. So you've heard about this fermentable oligosaccharide, disaccharide, monosaccharide, and polyol. These are things that are associated with irritable bowel syndrome.
FODMAP, fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols, short-chain carbohydrates that the small intestine absorbs poorly, can cause cramping, diarrhea, constipation, bloating, and gas.
So basically, you have this artificial sweetener, which is technically called sugar alcohol, and it gives you the sweet taste in your tongue, nice, but it's non-caloric, so it doesn't really get absorbed by the body. So it passes down to the intestines. So then what? So the bacteria will ferment it instead. What do bacteria do when they ferment it? They produce gas. You get bloated. And if it doesn't, before it gets fermented, it has an osmotic effect, so it draws fluid. So you end up with bloating and diarrhea. And that's why, if you have a look at the packet on diabetic lollies or chewing gum or anything with artificial sweeteners, you'll see the warning, excess consumption may have a laxative effect. So certainly, if you're having any gastrointestinal issues, then you should be staying away from artificial sweeteners like the sugar alcohols. And as a rule of thumb, if it ends in ol, so sorbitol, xylitol, mannitol, they're all sugar alcohols.
Right. But what about, say, stevia? Is that something that you recommend?
Look, the other problem with artificial sweeteners is addictive eating behaviors. So they stimulate the mesolimbic pathway. And basically, this is the pathway that rewards us for, we do something, we get this release of dopamine, we feel good, and it makes us want to repeat that behavior. The problem with artificial sweeteners is that they lead to an activation of this pathway as well. So if there's an eating behavior that you're trying to break, be it trying to overcome an addiction to sweet foods, then the continued consumption of even artificial sweeteners is going to be contributing to that.